It was supposed to be the most ordinary errand of the week, the kind of uneventful Thursday evening grocery run that blends into every other adult responsibility in a life measured by receipts, shopping lists, and the quiet satisfaction of a stocked refrigerator. Yet somehow it turned into one of the most bizarre public confrontations I have ever experienced, all because I chose to pay with a check in my local grocery store and a stranger decided that my method of payment was suspicious enough to justify calling the police. The store was busy, but not chaotic. Just the usual after-work rush where people in office clothes stood behind carts filled with produce, cereal boxes, frozen dinners, and laundry detergent, while the hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the soft beeping of barcode scanners and the distant whir of the automatic doors opening and closing every few seconds. I had spent nearly 40 minutes carefully moving through the aisles, comparing prices on chicken breasts, grabbing canned tomatoes for a pasta sauce I plan to cook on Saturday, picking up cereal my niece likes when she stays over, and adding a small chocolate cake because it was her birthday weekend. And by the time I rolled my cart into line, I felt that quiet sense of accomplishment that comes from completing a necessary chore efficiently. When it was my turn at the register, the cashier, a young college-aged guy I had seen several times before, greeted me casually and began scanning my items with practiced speed, sliding them down the belt toward the bagging area as the total climbed steadily on the digital screen until it finally settled at $187.40, which was higher than I expected, but not shocking, given grocery prices these days. And without hesitation, I reached into my wallet and pulled out my checkbook, a habit I have maintained not out of nostalgia, but practicality, because I share certain household expenses with my father and prefer having a clear paper trail for some transactions, especially after my debit card information had been compromised a few weeks earlier and I was still waiting for the replacement to arrive. The cashier did not react at all, which reassured me that this was not an unusual request, and he simply nodded and asked for my ID as I began writing the check with deliberate care, filling in the date, the store's name, and the amount in both numerical and written form, making sure my handwriting was legible because I have always believed that small details reflect character. Yet before I could even finish signing my name, I heard an exaggerated sigh behind me, the kind that is not accidental, but intentionally loud enough to signal disapproval. And although I initially ignored it under the assumption that someone was simply having a long day, the sigh came again, sharper and more pointed, followed by a muttered comment that I could not fully hear, but clearly sense was directed at me. I turned slightly and saw a woman standing behind her cart with her arms crossed, sunglasses still perched on top of her head even though we were indoors. Her expression a mixture of impatience and disbelief as though I had personally violated some unspoken social contract, and when she said, "Are you serious?" in a tone dripping with irritation, I felt the first flicker of discomfort, but responded politely, explaining that it would only take a moment, which only seemed to irritate her further as she launched into a commentary about how people do not use checks anymore and how this was precisely why checkout lines move slowly, her voice growing louder with each sentence until other customers began glancing in our direction. I tried to maintain composure, reminding myself that frustration over waiting in line is common and usually harmless. Yet her remarks escalated quickly from impatience to accusation when she declared that using a check was suspicious and implied that it could be fraudulent, referencing vague stories about scams she claimed to know through a relative in banking. And despite the cashier calmly informing her that the check was processed electronically and approved through the system, she refused to accept this explanation, insisting that approval did not guarantee legitimacy and that she did not feel comfortable standing near what she described as obvious fraud, a phrase that stunned me not because it made sense but because it was delivered with such absolute conviction. Before I fully grasped what was happening, she stepped out of line, pulled out her phone, and announced loudly that she was calling the police, which at first I assumed was an empty threat born from dramatics. Yet when she dialed 911 and began describing me as a man attempting to pass a suspicious check at the grocery store, I realized that this was no longer just a social misunderstanding, but a situation with real-world consequences. And although I knew I had done nothing wrong, the sudden shift from routine transaction to potential law enforcement involvement triggered a wave of adrenaline that made my hands feel cold despite the warm store lighting. The store manager arrived quickly after the cashier alerted her, listening carefully as he explained that the check had been verified through the standard electronic process and that there was no indication of fraud, yet the woman remained adamant that she was protecting the store, and the community by reporting suspicious activity, framing her actions as civic responsibility rather than overreaction, and the manager, maintaining admirable composure, informed her that everything was under control and that there was no need for police involvement. But by that point, the call had already been made, and we were left waiting for officers to arrive, creating a tense atmosphere where ordinary shoppers suddenly found themselves spectators to an unfolding spectacle. When the two officers entered the store, the energy shifted immediately as conversations hushed and people pretended to browse nearby shelves while clearly watching, and the woman pointed at me without hesitation as though identifying a suspect in a lineup, her certainty seemingly unshaken by the manager's assurances. And although the officers approached calmly and professionally, asking me for identification and a brief explanation, I could not ignore the surreal nature of standing beside my cart of groceries, while being questioned over a payment method that has been legally accepted for generations. Yet I complied fully, handing over my driver's license and calmly stating that the check had been approved and that I was willing to answer any questions necessary. The officers cross-checked the name on my ID with the information on the check, confirmed with the cashier that the transaction had processed successfully, and within minutes determined that no crime had occurred, returning my identification with a polite apology for the inconvenience. Yet even as they walked away to speak with the woman who had initiated the call, I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief, aware that what had just transpired was not merely an awkward exchange, but a demonstration of how quickly ordinary situations can escalate when someone interprets inconvenience as threat. I overheard parts of their conversation with her, including a reminder that emergency services should not be used for non-emergencies, and a warning about misusing 911. And although she attempted to justify her actions as caution, her earlier confidence appeared diminished under official scrutiny. Yet she did not apologize to me or acknowledge the disruption she had caused, instead retreating into silence as I gathered my bags and headed toward the exit, my thoughts racing not with anger, but with exhaustion over the unnecessary drama injected into a simple grocery trip. Outside, as I loaded my purchases into the trunk of my car under the fading evening light, I replayed the sequence of events in my mind, marveling at how a decision rooted in practicality could be reframed by a stranger as criminal intent, and I considered how often modern impatience manifests as moral superiority, where deviation from the most current technology or trend becomes grounds for suspicion rather than curiosity. And while I understood that fraud exists in the world, I also recognized that systems are in place precisely to verify transactions before they are completed, making her intervention not protective but redundant. Later that night, recounting the story to my father as we unpacked groceries and stored leftovers, I realized that what unsettled me most was not the police involvement itself, but the casualness with which someone felt entitled to involve them, as though law enforcement were an extension of personal frustration rather than a resource reserved for genuine emergencies. And my father's quiet observation that people confuse inconvenience with danger captured the essence of the incident more succinctly than any detailed analysis could, highlighting how emotional discomfort could be misinterpreted as a legitimate threat when filtered through entitlement. In the days that followed, I returned to the same store without hesitation, determined not to let the incident alter my routine or instill unnecessary self-consciousness about using checks. And when the cashier greeted me with a light-hearted joke about my dangerous payment method, we both laughed, acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. Yet beneath the humor lingered an awareness that such overreactions are not isolated events, but reflections of a broader social pattern, where suspicion often precedes understanding and escalation replaces conversation. Ultimately, the experience reinforced a simple truth that I have come to value more deeply: ordinary, law-abiding actions do not require apology or justification simply because they diverge from someone else's preferences. And while technology continues to evolve and payment methods grow increasingly digital, the legitimacy of a choice should not hinge on its popularity, but on its legality and intent. And although I cannot control how others interpret my actions, I can control my response, choosing calm over confrontation and dignity over defensiveness, recognizing that sometimes the most powerful statement is the quiet continuation of normal life despite the noise created by those who mistake inconvenience for crisis.